Our next speaker is Dr. Christine Taylor, and Chris is a senior nutrition scientist at the Office of Dietary Supplements. She has held a number of nutrition science, policy, and management positions in Washington, D.C. and overseas. She previously held a position at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, where she worked in the foods area. In her last position with the agency, she served as the director of FDA's Office of Nutritional Products, Labeling, and Dietary Supplements. She will talk about safety, the concept of safety, its measurement, and reporting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor.
Thank you and good morning. My presentation is really going to be sounding a lot of the themes that you've heard already, and I hope it kind of integrates it within the separate context of safety. I will be organizing the presentation on three kinds of touchstones, which I call the expectations for safety. The first is that the substance, when used as directed, causes no harm and contraindications are known. One touchstone. The second is that the total product is safely manufactured and marketed. And the third is that if harm occurs, monitoring is in place and there can be a ready response. I do want to emphasize that we're talking here about safety, not efficacy or, in deference to Dr. Sesso, effectiveness. Safety issues for this presentation are not the same as effectiveness and efficacy. Again, a little bit of a review for you, I'm sure. I want to underscore that dietary supplements are regulated as foods. And as you probably heard from, I think, an earlier FDA speaker, they now have a separate Office of Dietary Supplement Programs at FDA. That was not the case when I was there a number of years ago. The other kind of theme I'm sure you've heard before is that the manufacturer is responsible for ensuring the safety, and that there isn't, for most products, there isn't a pre-market review. FDA bears the burden of proof and safety consideration in many cases. So those, again, are things you've probably heard from others. Understanding the difference between a food and a drug sounds simple, but in many cases, it's a little bit of a gray area. One way to think about it, at least for this presentation, is that in the drugs world, you're talking pre-market. The substance is assumed to have risk. It's assumed that the benefit is going to outweigh the risk, and that the benefit and the risk are in the same population group. The person taking the drug is the person who will have both the benefit and the risk. And the demonstration of safety is before marketing. You go through an FDA procedure. In the case of foods, which includes dietary supplements, the starting point is more or less that the substance is assumed to be safe. And in the absence of benefit, risk is really generally not very acceptable. However, we see in the world of dietary supplements that the risk and the benefit often are not in the same population. An example might be folate, which is used as a supplement for neural tube defect risk reduction. But for those that are concerned about folate in the food supply, there are questions of masking B12 deficiency, and some are even suggesting an increase in things such as prostate cancer. Two different populations, that's the point. And in any case, the demonstration of safety and benefits is not FDA approved prior to marketing, so it's considered a post-marketing world in terms of at least FDA's role, regulatory world, in safety. Looking at it another way, this is just a picture. In the case of pre-market, which is drugs, over on the left, you've got an assumed unsafe. That's your starting point, is that it is assumed unsafe. And then you move through giving the evidence to FDA. It's deemed safe and then marketed. In the case of pre-market, the manufacturer takes most of this responsibility. Should there be a problem, the evidence is gathered by the regulators. It's declared unsafe and then removed from the market. It's just a different way of looking at pre and post-market. Now, some of the challenges that are faced in the world of dietary supplement safety really do have to do a little bit with the product itself. Dietary supplements, some of these numbers are hard to come by, but currently there are estimates that there are 85,000 on the market. That number will vary depending on who you talk to. Some have suggested that 1,000 new products are introduced each year. What's the point here is that there's a diverse set of manufacturers making supplements. There are quite a few who are quite mainstream. You find them in New Jersey and California making very good products, but it is also a world where you do have some people who are perhaps not quite as mainstream. The conversation often goes to making dietary supplements in your garage. Difficult to know how many there are. You have online issues with this. The point is that it's a diverse set of manufacturers. On top of it, there's a lot of them. The latest numbers out of FDA say that more than 12,000 facilities have now registered with FDA, domestic and foreign. And interestingly enough, from the FDA inspection reports, about 1 in 5 citations that they give relate to the failure to set specifications for identity, purity, strength, and composition. In other words, in manufacturing the supplement, probably one of the bigger problems is just checking to make sure you have what you think you have. And this has to do with diverse supply lines and fractured supply lines, which we'll talk about in a minute. The flip side of this is there's also the nature of the substance that can present challenges in the world of dietary supplement safety. You have an interesting, and I'm sure many would believe, promising world of emerging bioactives, nutritional substances, not your classic essential nutrients. And these present challenges in knowing exactly both what they do and whether they cause harms. But flipping up to the other side, you also have the traditional nutritional substances, which I like to think of as a matter of balance. Anything is going to be risky at a particular level. And it's often portrayed this way, where you have an increase in risk, whether it's risk of deficiency or risk of adverse effects, as intake increases. Risk goes down for deficiency as intake increases, and then as intake continues on, at least in the classic nutrient, you have an increase in risk. And our focus, of course, for safety is over here on the right-hand side of the risk curve. It's a U-shaped risk curve. I won't go into the dietary reference values. I hope at some point someone else has given you a considerable background on these. But the interest for us is the tolerable upper level. Down here in the risk of preventing deficiency or promoting health, you have average requirements in this area. But what happens is you start to increase intake, you're able to establish, as the Institute of Medicine has, the tolerable upper level, which is the point at which, after intake, you begin to see a risk or an increase in adverse effects, theoretically. Now, I'd said that we were organizing ourselves on 3 touchstones for expectations for safety, the first being the substance, when used as directed, causes no harm. One way to start to think about this is the type of safety concerns that are associated with substances. The first is that there is inherent toxicity at the upper levels of intake. It's the classic, the dose is the poison. Examples of this might be vitamin D, a perfectly fine nutrient at lower levels, but as you begin to take increased amounts, there's the risk of kidney damage. Caffeine is another. At lower levels, as far as we know, there's not harm. But as caffeine gets concentrated, powdered, and encapsulated at high levels, there's been increasing reports of deaths from these powdered caffeine supplements. Second is this concept of the history of use for a supplement, or a supplement substance, I should say. And it is difficult for history of use to provide a lot of substance for a safety concern, especially if the product isn't used the same way that it was in its original history of use consideration. And the theme that will be sounded here is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. One example is kava kava, which is a root found in the South Pacific, which has often been used to brew a kind of soothing tea. Kava kava was taken by people into Europe and the US and kind of concentrated, made encapsulated form, and began to be marketed for calming effects, for a variety of postmenopausal syndrome. issues and a kind of healthful, making life a little easier. However, we began to see in Europe liver injuries and some problems. So the question was, is brewing it as a tea as opposed to slicing, dicing, chopping it, and encapsulating it, really is that a history of use that's relevant? A third component here is what we might say is an illegal, but nonetheless possible substance that's of interest to certain groups, and we often say you can protect the fool, but you can't protect the darn fool, and that is gamma hydroxy, or GHB, which is classified as a class 1 drug, meaning very similar to cocaine and heroin. It, of course, is not marketable as a dietary supplement, but its precursor, GBL, has been seen online as a dietary supplement. So even though this is not what you would consider to be a sanctioned use, it's still obtainable and it can be a safety concern. And then the fourth issue in this kind of category of types of safety concerns is an interaction, usually with a drug. St. John's wort being a good example of established interactions with HIV protease inhibitors. Again, a safety concern. Now, other types of safety concerns do exist. One obviously is the situation of a contaminant or an adulterant. Plantain, which has been marketed as a colonic cleanser, there's a somewhat famous case at FDA where plantain, which looks a lot like digitalis, people were using what they thought was plantain for colonic cleansing, but in fact it was digitalis lanata. Again, this is not, the substance plantain was not a problem, but it was an adulterant contaminant issue, and there were quite a number of adverse effects relative to heart problems. An herbal weight loss product from Asia was marketed and turned out to be contaminated with aristolochia, which caused considerable kidney damage. So again, a contaminant adulterant type of safety issue. And then there's the list from the Center for Drugs, which it's an interesting list. It's called the tainted list, which means that these are products that have been identified as labeled as dietary supplements, but containing what CEDAR calls hidden drugs that actually make the supplement more effective. And there's a long list of these that apparently are still available on the market. The second is manufacturing error. Total Body formula from a number of years ago, the manufacturer put in a considerable amount of selenium, way over what was needed, and there were adverse effects from that. And then the third category is what we call inappropriate use by consumers, and this can vary anywhere from really the true tragedy of infant iron poisonings, where infants or small children accidentally overdosed on iron supplements, which led to legislation for the blister packs and all of the protective kind of things you now see around iron supplements for children, all the way to people choosing to use dietary supplements in place of what would be proven therapies. In other words, if you've, maybe a good example that came up before is if you've got a statin and you want coenzyme Q, not to say that coenzyme Q is or isn't effective, but this concept of, well, I don't want to take the drug, but I will take a dietary supplement. That would fall under the category sometimes of inappropriate or unsafe use by consumers. Now, in terms of evaluating safety, what we have mostly in our heads tends to be a tendency about how you evaluate for benefit. And we kind of have to turn that a little bit on its ear when we talk about evaluating for safety. We do have, obviously, the possibility of human studies, intervention trials. These are oftentimes called the gold standards for efficacy and effectiveness. And of course, observation and ecological studies. We also have available for safety demonstrations preclinical testing, which could be animals in vitro or in vivo, the history of safe use, and probably I should include number 4, post-market surveillance here, but in a few minutes I'm a little nervous about saying it's a very strong tool for evaluating safety, in part because it is post-market, but I'll mention that in a few minutes. Now, the human studies, Dr. Sesso's done a great job, so I will just race through this. The pros of these classic intervention trials are that they have experimental designs, they can deal well with statistical hypothesis, and they have very strong evidence for causality. The cons, obviously, again, Dr. Sesso dealt with expensive, time-consuming, and somewhat difficult to organize and control. What is the issue for us with intervention trials is that ethically, it's very, very difficult to use an intervention trial to demonstrate harm. Obviously, when you think about intervention trials, you're thinking about demonstrating benefit and you're trying to avoid harm. To set up a clinical trial that said, okay, let's randomize you to a group that's going to be harmed and the rest of you will randomize you to a group that isn't, obviously that's not going to work. So safety data from trials usually is a secondary outcome of the trial. This means that the database tends to reflect studies that are designed, obviously, to test benefit and to minimize risk. They include power calculations focused on benefit, not on safety. They have durations based on the interest in benefit. They exclude often at-risk participants. They select a dose with a safe profile. And because they're not expecting adverse effects, many of these are really not set up to monitor for this. So you have this idea that when you do have an intervention trial and you're getting information from it on safety, it's really an uphill battle. But I will say that if these trials do show an adverse effect, that's very, very powerful because it overcame all of those handicaps to demonstrate that there was, in fact, a kind of safety concern. The other part of human studies, the observational studies, again, I'm sure this has been gone over ad nauseum. The pros being that they are free-living, often of long duration, large sample sizes, and they can be exploratory. The cons, though, as I'm sure you've heard, they're not reliable predictors of effect, and they can be impacted by confounders. So in terms of human studies, in the observational range, all of them, the ecological, cross-sectional, case control, and cohort, while they're there, while they can be useful, they all have shortcomings. And these are listed here on the slide. What these shortcomings can mean is that sometimes the direction that you start off with observational trial will get, an observational data will get overturned by a clinical trial. There's a couple of these very famous ones. The beta-carotene observational data looked like beta-carotene was really going to be great for cancer. Got it into a trial, and it appeared to increase the risk of lung cancer. Hormone replacement, well, obviously not a dietary supplement, same kind of thing. Observational studies suggested benefit, and the trials were increased risk. So there's this difficulty in using observational data in the ability to overturn some of your initial conclusions. Now, in terms of the preclinical studies, my personal opinion is that this is probably the direction of the future for safety for dietary supplements. They're targeted and systematic. They don't require a priori hypotheses. And a lot can be carried out in animal studies that are challenging in humans. The weaknesses, though, will be that their relevance to human condition and the need to extrapolate will be extremely difficult. Third, the history of safe use. This has been relied on fairly heavily, in my opinion, by the dietary supplement industry. Understandably, data are out there. But the history of use for many of these particularly emerging bioactive substances must be predicated on the same conditions of use and the same substance. So how has the product been formulated and what are its directions for use? I go back to that comment on kava kava earlier, in which it appeared to be safe, brewed as a tea in the South Pacific, no injuries that were obvious, but when brewed as a soothing tea in the South Pacific may not be the same when marketed for anxiety, insomnia, and stress in Europe when the product is formulated slightly differently. So the question really is, are you using it the same way, and are you sure you have the same substance? Is that root from the South Pacific exactly what you're using in Switzerland to make your dietary supplement? So not only is the history of safe use predicated on the conditions of use, we really have to embrace the fact that it's not always a good or reliable predictor of safety. It really is derived population-based. You can't link it to specific effects. You can't follow it systematically, and it's questionable whether it's reliable for chronic disease. So again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is, however, and we need to acknowledge this, useful for practical matters. Things such as vinegar, spices, baking powders, history of safe use for these kinds of substance makes perfect sense. I think the question in everyone's mind is history of safe use adequate for some of these emerging substances and bioactives. So summing all of that up in terms of challenges for studies focused on the safety of food substances, we have to admit right off the bat that we don't have a lot of data on safety. It's just not something one tees up routinely for a grant to study adverse effects. It's a very difficult thing to, especially among humans, subject them to risk. So safety is often not directly testable given ethical concerns, which means, to my mind, that we need some new paradigms for how we think about testing for safety. We need innovations for trials. We need more targeted use of these preclinical studies. I think computer modeling in the world of dietary supplement safety has been generally overlooked. And we haven't done perhaps as good a job as we could have adapting relevant toxicology methods. Because in effect, what you're really looking at are some of the toxicological questions of these substances. And of course, we need specific tools for interactions with other substances. The real bottom line here is that safety substantiation is difficult to establish using our typical gold standards for benefit. We do have to rely on observational, secondary, and what I call inadvertent information when it comes to safety, at least at this point in time. Which means until we get to better techniques, benefit will always be held to a slightly higher substantiation standard than harm. You can probably use observational studies to take some types of regulatory action or at least demonstrate a safety concern in this world that we live in today. The other point I do want to make in terms of the safety for substance is that you have to consider the total amount taken by the user. I can't tell you how often that gets overlooked in safety considerations. Many supplements provide 100% of the recommended intake, and they're an add-on to an existing diet. So it's very important when you consider the safety of some of these substances to be aware that most people, because these are nutritional substances, are not taking in 0 levels of the substance. It's an add-on. A good example being the Women's Health Initiative trial. This trial of 36,000 postmenopausal women, the interest was in a placebo versus 1,000 milligrams per day of calcium. What in effect was going on, however, was that these women were also taking approximately 1,000 milligrams of calcium in addition to what they were getting in the study. So the total was not normal versus 1,000, it was normal versus over 2,000 for calcium. And in some cases, they did see increased incidence of kidney stones. Again, an inadvertent safety study, but one in which the baseline intake was absolutely a key consideration, as it would be in all of these exposure questions. The other thing to mention, as you've heard repeatedly, is that those people who are taking dietary supplements are generally better nourished, which means that if you don't take into account the entire total exposure, you've missed some of the skewing that would occur at the upper ends of intake. And that can be a safety concern. This is an example from folate, in which if you just considered the food, the rise from the 10th percentile to the 50th percentile to the 90th percentile, if shown as a distribution, is pretty even. But when you consider total exposure, which means the intake of supplements, the rise from the 10th to the 50th seems pretty normal, but then at this upper end, the skewing of tail, you get this huge increase. So with dietary supplement use, you get a skewing in a distribution of exposure towards the right-hand upper end. Total exposure also, by the way, means considering bioavailability or bioequivalence, examples being calcium. What was the source of the calcium? Was it carbonate, citrate, or formate? And some will even argue that different forms of vitamin D are relevant to total exposure. So these are all factors that need to be taken into account as you consider the safety of the substance. In terms of conditions of use, this also is something that can be easily confused with an approach to safety that gets overlooked. Conditions of use do affect the safety. Duration of use, is it long versus short? Is it formulated as a single source or is it included in a mixture? Who, in fact, is taking this? What's the health status of the person? What's the life stage? Are they pregnant? Are they a young child? And there's a potential to interact with other substances taken into account, drugs and other supplements. So the safety of a substance doesn't just sit there as a kind of point. It's actually a moving target depending on the conditions of use. And then a fourth thing is that if the substance resembles heroin, cocaine, or something like that, guess what? It's probably not safe. Second, expectations for safety. The total product is safely manufactured and marketed. This gets into the good manufacturing practices that are regulated by FDA and under its 2007 rules. The purpose of the Good Manufacturing Practices rules was to clarify for manufacturers what FDA is looking for should they inspect. Under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, manufacturers have responsibility to substantiate the safety of their products if asked to provide information. So on that basis, FDA promulgated these rules, Good Manufacturing Practices, which are kind of a guidance for them. They apply to all domestic and foreign companies that distribute, and they're regulations really to identify the purity, strength, and composition of the product, and from that stems the concept of safety. The requirement includes the provisions listed here, the condition of the plant, the quality control procedures, the testing of the final product, the handling of consumer complaints, and the manufacturing of records. These are good manufacturing practices which are designed to enhance the ability to produce a safe product. These are examples of problems that GMPs tend to minimize, getting too much or too little into the product, getting the wrong ingredient. If you remember back before, I said 19% of the citations FDA gives are for failure to test to see if you have the right ingredient. Foreign material in a dietary supplement container, anything from glass to rat droppings, improper packaging, and a mislabeled product. And as I think happens, we just said that most common blooper is, do you trust your source? Do you have what you think you have? Is it not fraudulent, or is it not what you think it is? Is it plantain, or is it digitalis? Third, if harms occur, monitoring is in place and problems can be responded to in a timely manner. Our third touchstone for the expectation for safety. Again, let's go back to pre and post-market. In the case of pre-market, you do have some approval of safety before it happens. Post-market, FDA gathers the evidence of the risk of harm and regulatory actions occur. So remember, in the world of dietary supplements, we're in a post-market world where the unsafety of the situation has to be documented and proven. One helpful tool is adverse event reports. Adverse event reports do detect unanticipated adverse effects. The point is under real-world conditions. But they're not an ideal safety evaluation. But beyond the manufacturer's self-determined safety, they can be a basis for safety activities. They do serve as a signal, but they do underestimate adverse effects because not everything is reported. And in many cases, luck is a factor. You happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right piece of information. So while helpful, they're not ideal. Under the statute, there is a definition of an adverse event. It's a persistent or significant disability or incapacity. It's hospitalization. It's a congenital abnormality or a birth defect, or a life-threatening experience, or death. Obviously, an adverse effect is death, but most of them that are reported consist of these other types of things. Now, the challenge in using adverse effects as a basis for significant or unreasonable risk, which allows for regulatory action, is that they're usually, if you go through the adverse event report system, they're usually fairly non-specific, headache and GI distress, which is difficult to kind of separate from other kinds of reports. They often will lack product information. They knew they took a supplement, but they don't know which one. The consumer reports, no matter how good they are going to be less useful to regulators than would be medical records. And again, for obvious reasons, chronic diseases or conditions are not readily identified. The other factor here is that you usually need a complement of research, biological plausibility, and other types of activities, which are often not carried out and funded, in order to make adverse effect reports truly useful for safety purposes. Now, they can be and should be reported through a number of different ways, perhaps the best being the FDA MedWatch system. It is voluntary reporting for adverse events. Anyone can report an adverse event through the FDA MedWatch system. They now have a special portal for dietary supplements. And they can be found online. The Poison Control Centers of America often also take reports on dietary supplement adverse effects. There are other ways, however, that adverse effects are put out there for public information. One is that sometimes in the medical literature, physicians will have seen this and will make case reports that are then published in places like the New England Journal of Medicine. And now reports can be reported to the manufacturer under the DSNDCP Act, which is the Dietary Supplement and Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act, which was passed in 2006. Under this act, dietary supplement labels must contain address or phone number or some way for the person to report an adverse effect to the manufacturers. The companies must report the information received within 15 business days to FDA, and they must submit any related medical information, and they have to keep records. So as of 2006, this was yet another way to track adverse effects that may occur with dietary supplements. In terms of this monitoring and FDA's key focus, their priorities are clearly to remove from the market products dangerous to consumers, products that contain harmful pharmaceutical substance, and to enforce the GMPs. That would be their three priorities. And when you put it all together in the post-market world, you have the acknowledgement that FDA has limited resources for investigation. If there's 85,000 products on the market and a lot of activity in terms of substances coming in and out, this is obviously a resource-intensive type of activity, and there are not a lot of resources to do this. So that's point number one. Point number two is that you do have some help from others. I know it's an old New England Journal of Medicine report, but in 1998, a series of investigators did some work with Asian herbals and found that they were generally, or this particular sample was very heavily contaminated with heavy metals, and reported that in the New England Journal. So that's another source. The Government Accounting Office sometimes takes this on, and in 2010, they did a report on products that contained pesticide residues that exceeded the limit. So that's yet another source. So you have not only the adverse effect reports, but you have these kinds of reporting possibilities. And then, of course, FDA is also doing its own work. In terms of enforcement, FDA can now do a mandatory recall under FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and that doesn't require court action. If they feel the product and they can document that the product is unsafe, They can institute a mandatory recall. They can also go to the next level, which is a seizure. Seizure being focused on a particular lot or product. It requires court action. Perhaps one of the more recent famous ones, Kratom, which again has had a very euphoric kind of class 1 type of drug, which they did seize that as unsafe to consumers. And then I'm sure you've all heard of ephedra, right? The famous ephedra. Has anybody not heard of ephedra? We should mention ephedra. Ephedra is the example, I think the only example, of where through rulemaking, FDA actually banned the substance. And for those of you that are interested in the history of ephedra, it's quite a story. It took more than adverse events. There was quite a bit of meta-analysis, research, back and forth. The rulemaking was extensive and difficult. Questions about benefit, cost, benefit, risk. And in the end, as far as I know, the only rulemaking that banned a substance was ephedra. FDA also does do, and I should point out, quite a few warning letters and consumer alerts. These are often on weight loss products, pharmaceutical ingredients being found in these. So there's quite a bit of activity for them in that area. So with that, the quick state of play is that the manufacturers are responsible for exploring and ensuring safety. FDA provides guidance and monitors it. And thank you. Yeah. Way in the back.
Hello, my name is Mark Anderson. I'm with Consumer Lab. I just wanted to make a comment too, because it's not my presentation this afternoon, but in terms of safety, what we're seeing too is the dosage form makes a difference. Gummies, for instance, that are becoming very popular on the market, have lousy stability. And what they're doing is they're putting huge overages in these gummies. And they're putting in it, so the point is to look at the percent DVs on the label. Pay attention to those, because in some cases on these gummies, which is, everybody loves them because they're great. They're easy, it's a great dosage form, but the overages in some cases are tremendous. They're huge. And in some cases, they're not disclosing their overages, and what we're finding is 200% and 300% the DV. So that, in terms of safety, I just wanted to throw that comment in.
It's an excellent point, and I think the manufacturers have done that in order to, quote unquote, meet compliance should it ever happen, but the overages can be huge.
So you mentioned bioavailability, and I was just wondering if you know any situations where genetic variation can lead to differences in safety.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think of an example, but oftentimes when people talk about how a particular substance might affect a particular person, genetic variation might occur. I don't know offhand of any examples, unless you have one you're thinking of.
My current research project is kind of going to be
Sorry?
my current research project might be like circling around that idea, but I was also kind of curious if if anyone knows of any work done on that, or how it might affect your necessary daily intake of vitamin.
One thing to mention is that one of the questions of safety and risk benefit that often comes up at FDA, or at least used to come up at FDA, was that if the person can self-identify that they have a unique issue, then you are allowed, or it's possible to sell the product with a little warning on it. So something like, if something is not tolerable for, I'm making this up, a diabetic, it could say not to be used by diabetics. What you're talking about with genetics would require that the person also know that they have this genetic anomaly or whatever, and that the manufacturer, and then if you remember the first touchstone was that contraindications are indicated. So again, one thinks that what you're talking about is entirely possible. Is the cure for it labeling, I think is another component you might consider. behind you, someone had a question. Yeah.
So I have a burning question, and I don't know if you can answer it, but supplements you said earlier are classified as foods, right?
Under Deshay, they're foods,
Déchets,
right?
right? So with foods being around for eons, we evolved from foods, eating foods, and supplements being so highly engineered, shouldn't then be similar to medications classified into that?
Oh, I'm not going anywhere near that question. I think it's evolved, and it is evolving. I mean, clearly, many of the supplements on the market are classically used, for hundreds of years, and not a problem. Your question comes up to more of these emerging bioactives and where do they fall. And in the U.S., we do dietary supplements as foods. Other parts of the world don't. They have separate categories or they treat them differently. So what we should do in the U.S., we have what we have, but you ask a question that many people have asked. Yes, the green shirt. I can see the green shirt from here.
Wasn't there about 20 years ago a ban on tryptophan as well?
I'm sorry, what?
Tryptophan?
A ban on tryptophan.
Where
There were
used-
some problems with the manufacture of tryptophan, but I don't remember a ban per se. I think there might have been a seizure, which is different than a ban. But that was a long time ago. My memory doesn't keep up with it. Yes. Do we have time, Cindy? Yeah? Okay.
For drug manufacturers, they have to document safety before a drug is approved. So is there a gold standard for what drug manufacturers need to provide to the FDA in order to establish safety?
Oh,
And,
yes.
and I'm,
yes.
well, and it sounds like with dietary supplements, even though it's not required that safety is documented, it sounds like maybe there isn't a gold standard for establishing the safety of a dietary supplement. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I'm not sure what exactly we would say with the word gold standard. For drugs, there's a whole set of procedures and expectations, and FDA has set incredible guidance as to what they need to submit and how it will be reviewed. Deshay makes it clear that the manufacturer should take as much responsibility as needed to ensure safety. And many of them do, some of them obviously don't. And that's always going to be a problem. If you're saying, has someone said in order to convince us that your dietary supplement is safe, you need to do X, Y, and Z, does that exist in the regulatory world? The answer is no.
Okay. Well, for those of us doing clinical research on dietary supplements, do you have any suggestions for priorities for us adding to the literature to establish safety of dietary supplements that we're studying?
Good question. I think that there are a number of publications out there that talk about the key touchstones that we've mentioned today. I think it's going to depend on the substance, it's going to depend on the conditions of use, and for me right now to say, you need an intervention trial, obviously, ethically, that's going to be different, but it's a matter of gathering and sewing together. Can you do a clinical trial for harm? No. How do you pull together some of the observational data? There's quite a few publications. I'm looking at Paul Coates. There's been quite a bit done in terms of benefit, but a lot less done in terms of safety.
Right.
So it's a clear need.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that very informative presentation. You showed us the U-shaped curve relative to nutrients. Do you think that kind of concept could be helpful for us for non-nutrient per se things like the flavonoids, the polyphenolics, the dietary components that are a part of a lot of our supplements?
That is, I think that's a good question. Obviously, the U-shaped curve is meant to contrast itself with contaminants and adulterants, which at any level, there's no benefit. So the U-shaped curve says at one level there's benefit and at another level there's harm. Flavonoids, is there benefit at one level and is there harm at another? There's no reason why the U-shaped curve couldn't be imposed on them if you've got enough data. The starting point is the assumption that at some level there's harm and at another level there's benefit.
Thank you.
And flavonoids, I think the data are emerging.
We just need more, right? Thank you.
I guess if there's one thing I were to say as I get down from here is we need more data. But we also, very importantly, need more clever ways to measure safety. You can't pound on the table and say we need an intervention trial. You can't randomize people for harm. We've got to find another way.